Pleasant good day, everyone, and welcome to our second in our series of conversations that we're having concerning equity, our journey in equity. I hope everybody enjoyed, learned from, pulled on their inner selves to determine your own journey in this work. In the last time we spoke, we talked about creating and fostering an intentional space of belonging. And today we want to take that conversation further and get into our own continued responsibility as we look at growing in cultural competence. Growing in cultural competence. And this is one of the major things for me, and I think I mentioned this the last time, that growing in cultural competence is major in the work of equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, racial justice, in creating a more inclusive spaces, in creating safer spaces. We have to own and to understand that our cultural competence, our ability to understand each other, respect our differences, navigate the spaces that we are about is quite important in the process. And so for me, I start with a performance, a stage. And this is very, very intentional. What we have happening in the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion, I think we are plagued, a lot of our spaces are plagued with a performance. You know, we want to do equity. We are doing the equity thing. And, you know, well, I want to do the equity thing. And what happens is that we have not embodied the work. You find that so many of us are not authentic to the work. We have gotten to use the term allyship, for instance, and it's very widely used. And it's being used for everyone as a label. Let me put a label on myself. I'm an ally. You want a pin? You want to wear an ally pin. But ask yourself, what is required if I say to myself, I am an ally? If I say to you, I am an ally, what does that require of me? And what we find is that so many of what we are doing in equity, diversity, and inclusion is plagued with performances. That is why we are not seeing changes, right? So many of the things around us in regard to anti-Black racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Indigenous, you know, the Truth and Reconciliation, and the list goes on. Many of our communities and identities are marginalized, and they are despondent. And they are despondent because it seems there are no real change. If you ask me, why am I doing this work? I would say to you, because I hope to impact as a change agent. I'm open for a better place, a better society, safer schools, more inclusive spaces. It's about the action. It's about the real change. And a lot of us, what happens when you are not intentional about the work you're doing, what happens is that we end up leaving the work. We end up signing off on the work of equity, and we signed off unchallenged, unchanged, and as the children would say, unbothered. Here is something I want you to understand. We need to be challenged, we need to be bothered, and we need to act on to make sure we are seeing changes. Too many of us are leaving the spaces and the discussions about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we are unchallenged. You know, we like to talk about a courageous conversation. What is a courageous conversation? When you are invited to a table to have a courageous conversation, what does that mean? Why do we call them courageous conversations? What we find, though, is a lot of persons walk away saying, well, I'm uncomfortable. But you wanted a courageous conversation, but you want to sit in your comfort. We can't have our cake and eat it too. You know, we have to understand that this work in equity, diversity, and inclusion, the work in social justice, the work to fight against inequities in education must be a work that is challenging. It challenges us. I love to use this statement when I say the work is heavy lifting. It's going to challenge us. And so I want us to walk away from this video, this conversation. I want us to walk away challenged and changed. And so we look at what we call here the cultural competency continuum. So this is called the Cultural Competence Continuum. And what it is ensuring that we ourselves are growing, are invested in us, in growing cultural competence, and we go from one stage to the next. It's a continuum. So I trust and know that none of us are here sitting in a space of cultural destructiveness. And I'm going to explain each of these later on. Our cultural incapacity, our cultural blindness. At least we're supposed to be at a place of cultural sensitivity, or what some people call pre-competence, pre-cultural competence, where you're coming to a place where you're open, you're understanding, you're growing. You know, I'm sure you've heard people talk about the growth mindset. Well, let me tell you something very disappointing. I have done this work quite a bit with educators, and I can tell you there are a lot of educators who do not have a growth mindset. You know, when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, as if it's a burden. We are not thinking about how do we move on. And so what we do, what we want to do, we want to have a discussion. We want to have a continuous discussion on our personal journey in equity, diversity, and inclusion. Each and every one of us, our individual personal journey. How are we growing? What does that look like? We want us to be intentional and ask ourselves, what is that looking like? What is my journey? What is my personal journey looking like? And ask yourself that. You know, I want us to talk about defining cultural competence. And there's a big word there I want us to identify: cultural humility. What does that mean? It simply means that we don't know everything, and we need to be sitting in spaces where we are more open to learning and unlearning. We need to sit in spaces where we are more open to understand somebody that we don't identify. I always say to people, if you are a white person, you will not have a black man's experience. You don't walk in this body of a black man, of an immigrant man, of a Jamaican. You know, so you have to understand when you meet somebody who is different, somebody who has a disability, somebody who has neurodiversity, somebody who is on the spectrum, somebody who identifies as LGBTQIA+, somebody because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of immigrant status, because of religion. When you meet persons like those and you want to grow in cultural competence, you have to be open to understanding that you don't understand. You have to be open to know that you don't know. You have to open to learn what you don't know, what you haven't learned before. And you also have to open to unlearning. That's why we have so many persons with unconscious bias, because what we have not done is consciously think about these biases and how we need to make sure we are lessening them and how to look at our unconscious biases. How are these things impacting the people we serve, the people we work along with? And so an increased understanding again of self and accountability in the dynamics of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the self again, as we talked in the last time. And then, of course, determining your place on the cultural continuum. And I love this part. I really love this part, because I always say to people, in my workshop, I've never asked anyone to tell me where you are at on the cultural competence continuum. I ask you to ask yourself, where are you? It's a question for you to ask yourself, where are you? It's a question for you to ask yourself, where am I on the cultural competence continuum? And then you ask yourself, why is it important for me to know where I'm at? And what factors help me to determine where I'm at? And how will I move along the continuum? How will I grow? How will I change? And so we want to do that. And of course, I'm not getting away from that. The idea that when you are now growing cultural competence, what does that look like in your actions? And so I want to ask you, I always ask this question, what does a journey in equity, diversity, and inclusion looks like for you? If I should ask you, what does a journey look like? Some of you are just coming on the journey. Some of you haven't started on the journey. Some of you have been on the journey. We're at different places. And I think a lot of us, been around this thing for years. I think a lot of us, we want the journey to look like this. This is a journey, a smooth sailing road, heading in one direction or heading in certain direction, the windows down, the top up, and just cruising through equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice, racial justice, homophobia, all the issues. Well, I'm sure you know it's not. The journey is more like this. It's entangled. It's, as I always say, it's heavy lifting. It's a place sometimes people are disappointed. You are discouraged, you are tired, you feel beaten up and pushed against. Whether you are racialized, whether you are identified as a racialized person, you identify with certain disabilities, whether you are an ally, a co-conspirator, whether you are a leader, all of us throughout that journey, if you are honest and genuine, you will realize that this journey is more entangled. But we're not supposed to be discouraged. What we need to do is realize that we are using our power and our privilege. We're using the access we have. We're using our assets and our access to create a more equitable, a more inclusive, a safer classroom for our students. So that is the purpose. That is the purpose of us making sure that we go through this. Because you ask yourself, well, why do I need to go through this? I just come to school, I could teach and go home. Why do I need to be bothered with all of these issues? Because the students we serve, the students we have committed to serve, are experiencing various levels of inaccess, various levels of inequities, various levels of inequalities, various levels of marginalization. We have students who are invisible in our school because of certain reasons. We have students in our school who have been victim of racism and abuse. And so as educators, we have to be ready. We have to be equipped. We have to have our tools. We have to be ready to challenge, and we have to have that moral courage. It's important. And so this picture is my favorite. And this picture is what I worry about. So you ask me, what do I worry about? I worry when we are standing still. I worry when we are parked up as educators. I worry when I do not see us being intentionally on the move to change. I worry when I do not see us intentionally on the move to challenge. I worry when I do not see us on the move intentionally to disrupt. Parked up is not it. So what is cultural competence? Cultural competence is about our will and actions to build understanding between people, to be respectful and open to different cultural perspectives, strengthen cultural security, and work towards equality in opportunity. The magic word for me there is relationship. Relationship building is fundamental to cultural competence, and it's based on the foundations of understanding each other's expectation and attitudes, and subsequently building on the strength of each other's knowledge. Two words I want to underline: will and action. We must have the will and we must have the action. And relationship is major for me. How have you worked at building those relationships with colleagues and parents and students and community? How are you doing that? How are your relationships? How are you building those relationships? Because relationship is at the center of the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Relationship is at the center. A lot of us, I think, get carried away thinking documentation and strategic planning is the center. The center is that relationship. When you talk about culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, when you talk about the different strategies you're using, it's about your relationship with your students. When you're talking about creating safer environment for who? It is relationships. When you talk about a seat at the table, who is being given a seat at the table? It is about relationship. Another definition comes to us from Guzman. Cultural competence is the ability of a person to effectively interact, work, and develop meaningful relationship with people of various cultural backgrounds. I want us to ask ourselves again, how are we doing that? How are we showing our respect for diversity? What does that look like? When you said you respect differences, when you said I respect differences, what does that look like? What does that respect look like? How is that respect demonstrated? What is the evidence of that respect? I want you to ask yourself those questions. What is the evidence of that respect? How is that respect demonstrated? Ask yourself those questions. Because as we go back to the code, gaining cultural competence is a lifelong process of increasing self-awareness, developing social skills and behaviors around diversity, and gaining the ability to advocate for others. I want you to see the process. I want you to see it's going from awareness. And I want you to see it's going to advocacy. Many of us, we are stuck at awareness. You know, a lot of us, we're stuck at awareness. Well, I want to be more aware. You know, I just come to listen. I just come to watch so I could be more aware. And for years, there are people, there are persons who have just worked at being aware. I think that's a lot of awareness that you have captured, a lot of awareness you have packed in your bags. Now, how do you take that awareness and move to action? How do you now take that awareness? Because we see it here, gaining cultural competence is a lifelong process. Increasing your self-awareness, developing the skills, I love that, and then you go into your actions. You go into your advocacy for others. It goes beyond tolerance, which implies that one is simply willing to overlook the differences. Instead, cultural competence includes recognizing and respecting diversity through our words and actions in all contexts. This quote right here is something that we need to spend quality time on discussing, examining, breaking down, understanding the dynamics of how we move from awareness, developing the skills, and advocacy. It's how we are growing. And I keep on pushing at the word growth. I hope you realize that, because what I see is that there are many of us who are stuck. We are not moving. A continuum is a moving. And so I want us to be very intentional about how we are doing that. So why cultural competence? You ask me, well, why do I need to grow in cultural competence? I always, before I get into anything else, you know, when I speak to young people, when I speak to the students, and they would say, well, why do I need to learn this? And I say to them, the world is bigger than your cul-de-sac that you live on. The world is bigger than your avenue or your street. The world is bigger than your community. The world, we live in a global world. If you want to be a global citizen, you want to learn how to interact with others. I want you to understand there is a bigger world out there. And I think too many of us have been sheltered, protected, and I would say kept from the bigger world. There are people who exist outside of your religion. There are people exist outside of your sexual preference. There are people exist outside of your understanding of certain conversation. There are people exist out of your identity. And I want us to be aware. We be aware, we grow, and then we know how to be better advocates. So why? Society is increasingly becoming globalized. The world is changing. If you ask many teachers right in your board, they will tell you 15 years ago, 20 years ago, their classroom was different. Because of immigration and migration, people are moving and the society is changing. I did a workshop called The Changing Face of Ontario. And we talk about the change in classrooms. We talk about the statistics. There's a research also by Professor Jim Ryan at University of Toronto that talks about inclusive leadership. And he interviewed a number of leaders, especially in certain areas, and they shared that the classroom has changed. They shared that they had never had a classroom with children from so many different parts of the world before. And so with that being said, people are the question comes to you is, well, how are you adjusting your pedagogy? How are you growing in your practice? How are you widening your understanding of globalization? How are you widening your understanding of others? Are you being intentional as an educator about your cultural competence? Are you being intentional as an educator about your pedagogy and your practice? Are you being intentional as an educator about your classroom culture and climate? We talk about this in the previous video. What are the implications for your practice? I love to ask that question. What are the implications for your practice? Okay, if the classroom is changing, if our society is increasingly globalized, what are the implications for your practice? What are the, I like to write. I'm sure you realize I write while I speak. It's just one of the things that I do, right? What are the implications then for your practice? What are the implications for your practice, right? You know, the persistent issues around cross-cultural contact, discrimination and related challenges, it's happening. It's happening. You see the discrimination, you see the homophobia, you see the Islamophobia, you see the racism, you see the anti-Black racism, you see the disruption, the discontent, you see the marginalization, you see certain populations are excluded, certain persons, certain spaces are unsafe. Why? How do I work as an educator? Discrimination and bias in various forms are hurtful. How do I prevent hurt? How do I act so my students know that I've been intentional about their safety? More than just writing something on a door and say, this is a safe space. We like to do that. This is a safe space. Everywhere you go, everybody's using that language. This is a safe space. What makes it a safe space? What has been your role in creating that safe space? And then we talk about the ongoing issues of racism and anti-Black racism in our institutions. And so with that being said, we go back again to what we need. The first thing we need to grow in cultural competence is awareness of self. I want you to take a minute to look at this slide. The first step in growing in cultural competence is a self-awareness. Understanding what makes you different. Being aware of your own bias and your own prejudice. We all hold them, of the unconscious bias. We hold them. Being aware of how you're gonna highlight those things and work at changing them. Be aware of how you're gonna grow in a knowledge of others. Cultural competence is about understanding others. That people are different. And how do I navigate those differences? Why do I have a bias against this person? Where it came from? And how, very important, and how that bias have impacted my work as an educator. I want you to ask that question. How have my unconscious bias impacted my work as an educator? How? You have to examine your power and your privilege and be conscious about the differences around you. And I love the last one. Of everything else, I love the last one. Being intentional and deliberate about inclusion. Let me just say this right now to everyone. Inclusive practices are not going to just pop out the sky magically. And you get up one day and be like, I am now inclusive. It doesn't work like that. I really want to center this for a minute. I want to say to us, it doesn't work like that. You have to be intentional. You have to be deliberate. You have to act at how do I grow in my understanding? How do I grow in creating that classroom culture and climate? How do I grow in creating that safer space? What am I doing as an educator intentionally, deliberately? That's my question for you. I want you to ask yourself, what am I doing as an educator intentionally, deliberately, to make sure I create that inclusive classroom? I think a lot of us are depending on magic to happen so the place become more inclusive. It's your job. It's your job. I love this quote from John and Freeman. You know, if you do not know what biases you harbor, you are powerless against them and may be harming others unintentionally. In that case, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is a privilege. It is important that we address our unconscious biases. You have to address these things, all right? And next, after you have an awareness of self, then the next thing you must have is an awareness of others. I like to say to people, what do you do on a daily basis that says to the people you serve, the people you work with, your students, your parents, the community, what do you do that says to people in very subtle, very bold, very intentional, very powerful, very explicit, also implicit ways, I see you. Too many of our students are made invisible. Too many of our students are made invisible in our schools, invisible by policies, invisible by practices, invisible by school rules, invisible by uniform policies, invisible by who gets access, invisible by, we have created barriers in our schools. Way too many of our students are becoming invisible. Ask yourself, how as an educator am I ensuring that my students know I see you? I see you. I see who you are. I see your language. I see your accent. I see your immigration status. I see your color. I see your food. I see your music. I see your dance. I see your culture. I see you. I see your struggle. I see how you're dealing with your mental health and your well-being. I see your family structure. I see the dynamics of who you are. I see the intersections. I see the intersections and I see the intersectionality. I see you. I see how religion have impacted you. I see how society have burdened you. I see how you're dealing with systematic issues. I see how you're navigating systematic oppressive practices. I see you. What are we doing that says to someone, says to our students, I see you? And so I want us as educators to be aware of patterns of discrimination and inequalities and injustice. Too many of us are turning a blind eye. Like I told a group of persons the other day, too many of us have had too many missed opportunities for us to have show our level of inclusion. Many of us have missed a lot of opportunities to demonstrate allyship. Many of us have lost opportunities and missed them to demonstrate we are real advocates, to demonstrate friendship, to demonstrate kindness, to demonstrate what would Jesus do. You know, when we get into these conversations, like I said to you the last time, we must talk about kindness, empathy, love. Those things are foundation to building more equitable spaces, to build in more inclusive spaces, to build in spaces in our schools where students feel a sense of belonging, to disrupt the things in our school that needs disrupting. Many of you have missed an opportunity to raise your hand and speak up and speak out. There are many of us who have missed those opportunities. I want you to walk away from this conversation today with a greater sense of accountability, a greater sense of your role as an advocate, a greater sense of your role as an educator, a greater sense of your role as a caregiver, a greater sense of your role as a human, a greater sense of your role as a Christian, committed to kindness and love. I think we have issues that I think we're hiding, especially as a Catholic board, a Catholic space, we are hiding from certain issues to really ask ourselves, are we being honest and genuine about how love is distributed, how love is offered, how kindness is given? Who is giving kindness? Do we get to decide that? Who is worthy of kindness and love? Who is worthy of a space of belonging, of safety? Who is worthy? That's something for us to think about. And so I want us to be careful and to be aware of how these patterns show up covertly in our communities. And I want to be aware of our role. Here we go again with accountability. And so there's another view of the cultural competence continuum. There's another view of it. And we have now added some explanation to it. And so I'm going to go through all of these. And we're going to share a better understanding of what it looks like. And so at the lower level of the continuum is cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, and cultural blindness. I'm going to give you an example. Years ago, I worked for a college, years ago, that got a whole bunch of students in who identify as Muslim. And they were registered. We took their school fee, got them in our classes, and they asked for a space to pray at lunchtime. And it was denied. It was denied. And it led to a whole conversation. And let's just say thankfully it ended well, and they were given the respect that they deserve. They were given the space they deserve as members of our school community. This is something I want to underline. They weren't granted anything that they shouldn't have been granted. Sometimes we feel like we are powerful and we are giving people permission to be themselves. We have to realize we shouldn't be granting people permission to be themselves. We should have just simply allowed people to be themselves. They are members of our school, our class, our board. And so what we saw in that example was cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, seeing the difference and try to stamp it out, seeing the difference and making it wrong, elevating the superiority of your own value and suppressing others. But what is common among us is the cultural blindness. We see the difference and we act as if you don't. acting as if the cultural differences you see do not matter or do not recognize that there are differences among and between cultures. Like I always tell people when they use the term, the Black experience, I say, what is the Black experience? There's no one way to be Black. There's no one way to be Christian. There's no one way to be Catholic. There's no one way to be Muslim. There's no one way to be a student. There's no one way to be an immigrant. We have to realize that even within race and within culture and within groups, there are also differences. And that's why assumptions and stereotypes and the single story is so dangerous. That is why we go back to the beginning when we talk about the importance of building relationships. And so at the higher end of the continuum, remember this is a continuum, we're talking about cultural destructiveness, cultural incapacity, cultural blindness, then moving up to cultural pre-competence or cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, and cultural proficiency. Now we go to the higher levels of the continuum. And we see cultural sensitivity or cultural pre-competence. And a lot of us, we are here. And if you're open to growth, you will be fine. Because we see the differences and we respond inadequately. But we are responding. And that's why I always tell people, you will make mistakes. You will make mistakes in this work of equity, because it's a lot for us to learn, and we are learning, and we have to honor the fact that we are learning, but we also have to be patient with ourselves and with each other. So you are going to mispronounce a word, a name. You're going to make certain assumptions. You're going to see that your unconscious bias, kicks in. But how you react to those things is important. Do you demonstrate the level of humility that says, I made a mistake. I do not understand. I want to learn. Let me try again. Let me understand it. Let me watch a movie, a video. Let me talk to somebody. Let me grow. Let me attend this workshop. Let me listen to this video so I could grow. How are you being intentional? So we see the difference. Responding adequately, recognizing the lack of knowledge and experience and understanding of other culture limits your ability to effectively interact with them. And people always ask me, Dr. ABC, where are you on the continuum? Because of course I've been doing this for years, so you may feel like I would say I am at cultural proficiency. And the truth is maybe I am at. But I like to keep myself at cultural competence. What that does is remind me that I don't know everything. Remind me that I do not have every single lived experience. As a matter of fact, I only have one lived experience. I walk in a body of a Black man. I walk in a body of an immigrant. I walk in a body of a Jamaican. I walk in a body of certain other identities that are for me. I do not walk in certain bodies. I do not live and come from certain experience. And that kind of knowledge is what makes me willing and able and intentional about my learning and my unlearning. And so this invite is to all of us as educators to think about how are we going to grow in cultural competence? How are we growing along this continuum? How are we moving from the lower levels of cultural destructiveness? We see it in many ways. We see it in our foods. We see it in our dress. We see it in our festivals. We see it in how we talk about language and second language and ESL. We see it in Canadian English and how you need to do this and how we describe people and how we value people and how we devalue people. and who is worthy of inclusion and who has to stay outside and who is Canadian and who is not and who gets certain access and space. We see these things happening and operating within and among us. How do we move to a level of competence? And so I always ask this kind of important question. Implications for your work. How are we developing cultural competence to foster relationships and connections? How are we developing cultural competence to foster relationships and connections? How are we doing that? How are we doing that? I want us to ask ourselves that. How are we doing that? So this, I want everybody to take a note of this. Implications for our work. How are we doing that? What does that look like as educators? What does that look like for us? What does that look like for us? And so I'm going to leave you, we're not going to do that slide. I'm going to leave you with 3 questions I want you to think about as we continue this conversation. Why is it important to know where you are on the continuum? What factors help you to determine where you placed yourself? Not where I place you, but where you place yourself. And most importantly for me is, what do you need to help you successfully move along the continuum in the right direction? And as we close this conversation, there's another conversation. We talk about our actions to promote inclusion within your school, within your classroom, within your space should be intentional and deliberate. But more than even that, I want us to go back to how we ended the last conversation. And it's going back to that space where you are going to engage in reflection and ask yourself, what am I learning? What am I unlearning? What questions do I have? What am I struggling with? And what actions will I take? I want to leave that level of reflection with all of us as we continue to think about the work we're doing and the work we're going to do and the work we're willing to do and the work we must do. What is it that I need to learn? What is it I need to unlearn? What questions do I have? What am I struggling with? And what actions will I take? Thank you for engaging in this conversation. Take it into your classrooms, take it into your staff room, take it into your staff meetings, take it home with you to have those conversations, because equity is not a thing we do. Equity is who we are. And that's a mistake many of us have made. Let me come to work and let me do the equity thing, not realizing the equity thing is in here. The equity thing is who you are as a person. Who you are as a person, kind, empathetic, respectful, receiving, welcoming, open to learn, open to grow. Understand when you make a mistake. Understand that things you do and say will hurt or harm someone. And how do you remedy that, fix that, change that? Those are the principles that we need to be working at and working with so we can grow in cultural competence. Thank you so much for engaging. Thank you so much for listening. Look forward to our continued conversation.